At Tiny Town, a dozen miles from the hill where the men of the two wrecked Blue Corps were plying their shovels in frantic anticipation of the overdue assault, Meade had heard nothing of the 8-hour battle, aside from the note in which Reynolds announced that he would fight the rebels inch by inch and hold them back as long as possible. Not even the booming of the guns came through, for though the east wind carried their rumble as far as Pittsburgh, 150 miles to the west, it was not audible 10 miles to the south, apparently having been absorbed by the round tops and the sultry air, which served as a soundproof curtain in that direction. In the early afternoon, however, a New York Times correspondent came riding back from Gettysburg on a lathered horse and requested the use of the Army telegraph in order to file a story on the fighting. Taken at once to headquarters, he could only report that the conflict had been fierce, that the issue had been in doubt when he left, and that one among the many who had fallen was John Reynolds. All of this was a shock for Meade. Not only had he lost the officer on whom he depended most for guidance during these first days of command, but 1/4 of his army had been committed, perhaps beyond the possibility of disengagement, a hard day's march north of his chosen position along Pipe Creek, which the engineers were still mapping and preparing for occupation. Moreover, a 2 o'clock dispatch from Howard, confirming the newsman's statement and adding that he'd sent for Sickles and Slocum, which would mean the commitment once they arrived of just over half the army, was followed by one from Buford, addressed to Pleasanton, announcing that 2 enemy corps, 2/3 of the rebel army it would seem, had made a junction on the heights northwest of town and seemed determined to press the issue to a conclusion, however bloody. Outnumbered and outflanked on the left and right, the defenders had been severely crippled, Buford added, by the untimely death of Reynolds and the resultant loss of coordination all along the line. In my opinion, the cavalryman closed his dispatch, there seems to be no directing person. P.S. We need help now. The note was headed 3:20 p.m., by which time help had been on the way for the better part of an hour. Substantial help, moreover, though it consisted of only one general and his staff. Hancock's corps had reached Tiny Town shortly before noon, and Meade had held it there while waiting to hear from Reynolds. When he heard instead of that general's death, he told Hancock to turn his corps over to Gibbon and ride to Gettysburg as a replacement for their fellow Pennsylvanian, with full authority to assume command of all units there and recommend whether to reinforce or withdraw them. He himself would remain in Tiny Town, Meade said, to control the movements of the other corps and continue work on the Pipe Creek line, which would be needed worse than ever in the event of a northward collapse. Hancock was 39, a year older than Sickles and 6 years older than Howard. All three had been promoted to Major General on the same day back in November, but the other two had been made brigadiers before him and therefore outranked him still. When he suggested that this might make for trouble up ahead, Meade showed him a letter from Stanton stating that he would be sustained in such arrangements by the President and the Secretary of War. So Hancock set out. He rode part of the way in an ambulance, thus availing himself of the chance to study a map of the Gettysburg area, which he had never previously visited, though he was born and raised at Norristown, less than 100 miles away. Coming within earshot of the guns, which swelled to a sudden uproar about 3:30, he shifted to horseback and rode hard toward the sound of firing. At 4 o'clock, the hour that Lee climbed Seminary Ridge to find the Confederate triumph unfolding at his feet, Hancock appeared on Cemetery Hill, a mile southeast across the intervening valley, to view the same scene in reverse. Wreck, disaster, disorder, almost a panic that precedes disorganization, defeat, and retreat were everywhere, a subordinate who arrived with him declared. One-armed Howard was there by the 2-story arched brick gateway to the cemetery, brandishing his sword in an attempt to stay the rout. But he was doing little better now than he had done 2 months ago at Chancellorsville under similar circumstances. Von Steinwehr, an old line Prussian and a believer in fortifications, had put his troops to digging on arrival, and the work had gone well, even though one of his 2 brigades had been called forward when the line began to waver north of town. The trouble was, there were so few men left to hold the hilltop, entrenched or not. Out of the 20,000 on hand for the battle, nearly half had fallen or been captured, while practically another fourth were fugitives who had had their fill of fighting, as was indicated by the fact that the provost guardsman of a corps that came up 2 hours later herded ahead of them some 1,200 skulkers encountered on the Baltimore Pike, which was only one of the 3 roads leading south. Fewer than 7,000 soldiers, the equivalent of a single Confederate division, comprised the available remnant of the 2 wrecked Union corps, including the brigade that had remained in reserve on the hilltop all along. With all too clear a view of the jubilant mass of rebels in the town and on the ridge across the way, Howard foresaw an extension of the disaster, the second to be charged against his name in the past 2 months. Anxious as ever to retrieve his reputation, which had been grievously damaged in the wilderness and practically demolished north of Gettysburg today, he was chagrined to hear from Hancock that Meade had sent him forward to take charge. "Why, Hancock, you cannot give orders here," he exclaimed. "I am in command, and I rank you." When the other repeated that such were Meade's instructions all the same, he still would not agree. "I do not doubt your word, General Hancock," he said stiffly, "but you can give no orders while I am here." Possessed of a self-confidence that required no insistence on prerogatives, Hancock avoided having the exchange degenerate into a public squabble by pretending to defer to Howard's judgment in deciding whether to stand fast or fall back. "I think this is the strongest position by nature on which to fight a battle that I ever saw," he said, looking east and south along the Fisher line of heights from Culp's Hill to the Round Tops. "And if it meets with your approbation, I will select this as the battlefield." When Howard replied that he agreed that the position was a strong one, Hancock concluded, "Very well, sir. I select this as the battlefield." Howard later protested that he had selected and occupied Cemetery Hill as a rallying point long before Hancock got there. This was true, but neither could there be any doubt when the time came for looking back that it was the latter who organized the all-around defense of the position, regardless of who had selected it in the first place. Meade had chosen well in naming a successor to the fallen Reynolds. 14 months ago, in the course of his drive up the York-James Peninsula, McClellan had characterized Hancock as superb, and the word stuck. Hancock the Superb, he was called thereafter, partly because of his handsome looks and regal bearing. "I think that if he wins citizen's clothes and should give commands in the army to those who did not know him," one officer observed, "he would be likely to be obeyed at once." But also because of his military record, which was known and admired by those below as well as by those above him. The Army's craving for heroes, or at any rate a hero, had not been diminished by the fact that so many supposedly qualified as such had melted away like wax dolls in the heat of combat. Hancock seemed an altogether likelier candidate. A Maine artilleryman, for example, recalling the Pennsylvanian's sudden appearance on Cemetery Hill, later asserted that his very atmosphere was strong and invigorating, and added, "I remember how refreshing to note even his linen clean and white, his collar wide and free, and his broad wristband showing large and rolling back from his firm, finely molded hands." Carl Schurz, who might have been expected to side with Howard, his immediate superior, found Hancock's arrival most fortunate at this juncture. "It gave the troops a new inspiration," he declared. They all knew him by fame, and his stalwart figure, his proud mien, and his superb soldierly bearing seemed to verify all the things that fame had told about him. His mere presence was a reinforcement, and everybody on the field felt stronger for his being there. His first order was for the troops to push forward to the stone walls that ran along the northern face of the hill in order to present a show of strength, and thus discourage an advance by the rebels down below. "I am of the opinion that the enemy will mass in town and make an effort to take this position," he told the captain of a battery posted astride the Baltimore Pike at the rim of the plateau. "But I want you to remain here until you are relieved by me or by my written order, and take orders from no one." It was clear to all who saw him that he meant business, and though Howard had chosen to defend only a portion of the hill, Hancock soon extended the line to cover it from flank to flank, after which he turned his attention to Culp's Hill. Half a mile to the east and slightly higher than the ground his present line was drawn on, that critical feature of the terrain had not been occupied, despite the obvious fact that Cemetery Hill itself could not be held if this companion height was lost. He told Doubleday to send a regiment over there at once. "My corps has been fighting, General, since 10 o'clock," the New Yorker protested, "and they have been all cut to pieces." Hancock replied, "I know that, sir, but this is a great emergency, and everyone must do all he can." With that, he turned away, as if there could be no question of not obeying, and when he came back presently, he found that Doubleday, whose regiments had been reduced to the size of companies in the earlier fighting, had sent Wadsworth's whole division to occupy the hill and the connecting saddle of high ground. It was, in fact, the shadow of a division, no larger than a small brigade, but the position was a strong one, heavily timbered and strewn with rocks that varied in size, as one defender wrote, from a chicken coop to a pioneer's cabin. Moreover, the lead division of Slocum's corps soon arrived and was posted there, too. Feeling considerably more secure, Hancock got off a message to Meade in which he stated that he believed he could hold his ground till nightfall, and that he considered his present position an excellent one for fighting a battle, although somewhat exposed to be turned by the left. Across the way on Seminary Ridge, Longstreet was expressing that same opinion even now. The difference was that old Peter was a subordinate, whereas Hancock was in actual command and therefore in a position to do something about it. Weak though the line was on those two hills to the north, the Pennsylvanians saw that it could not be held even in strength if those two commanding heights to the south, the Round Tops, were occupied by the enemy, whose batteries then would enfilade all the rest of the fishhook. And having noted this, he acted in accordance with his insight. Slocum's 2nd Division, but still not Slocum himself, he refused to come forward in person and take command by virtue of his rank, judging that Meade's plans for the occupation of the Pipe Creek line were being perverted by this affair near Gettysburg, which seemed to be going very badly. He would risk his men, but not his career. Heads were likely to roll, and he was taking care that his would not be among them. Was approaching the field soon after 5 o'clock when its commander reported to Hancock near the cemetery gate. "Geary, where are your troops?" he was asked, and replied, "2 brigades are on the road advancing." Hancock gestured south down Cemetery Ridge. "Do you see this knoll on the left?" He was pointing at a little round top. "That knoll is a commanding position. We must take possession of it, and then a line can be formed here and a battle fought. In the absence of Slocum, I order you to place your troops on that knoll." This was promptly done, and with the continuing forbearance of the Confederates, who obligingly refrained from launching the attack Hancock had predicted, Federal confidence gradually was restored. Here and there along the heights and ridges, men began to say they hoped the rebels would come on, because when they did, they were going to get a taste of Fredericksburg in reverse. Arriving with his lead division about 6 o'clock, Sickles was posted on the northern end of Cemetery Ridge, just in rear of Howard's and Doubleday's position on Cemetery Hill, which thus was defended in considerable depth. His other division would arrive in the night, as was Hancock's 3 under Gibbon, if Meade released them, to extend the line southward along the ridge leading down to the Round Tops. Once this had been done, the fishhook would be defended from Eye to Bob, and if Meade would also send Sykes and Sedgwick, reserves could be massed behind the high ground in the center, where they would have the advantage of interior lines and moving rapidly to the support of whatever portion of that convex front might happen to be under pressure at any time. All this depended on Meade, however, and when Slocum at last came forward at 7 o'clock, apparently he had decided to risk his reputation after all, or else he decided it was more risky to remain outside events in which his soldiers were involved. Hancock transferred the command to him and rode back to Taneytown to argue in person for a Gettysburg concentration of the whole army. 9 of his 19 divisions were there already, with a 10th one on the way. He arrived at about 9:30 to find his chief already persuaded by the message he had sent him 4 hours earlier. "I shall order up the troops," Meade had said after brief deliberation, and orders had gone accordingly to Gibbon, Sykes, and Sedgwick, informing them that the Pike Creek plan had been abandoned in favor of a rapid concentration on the heights just south of Gettysburg, where the other half of the army was awaiting their support. However, instead of going forward at once himself, there would be no time for a daylight reconnaissance anyhow. Meade decided to get some badly needed sleep. At 1 a.m. he came out of his tent, mounted his horse, and rode the 12 miles north with his staff and escort, a full moon floodlighting the landscape of his native Pennsylvania. At 3 o'clock, barely an hour before dawn, he dismounted at the cemetery gate, through which there was a rather eerie view of soldiers sprawled in sleep among the tombstones. Across the way on the western ridge and down in the moon-drenched town below, he saw another sobering sight. The campfires of the enemy, apparently as countless as the stars. Slocum, Howard, and Sickles were there to greet him, and though he had seen but little of the position Hancock had so stoutly recommended, all assured him that it was a good one. "I'm glad to hear you say so, gentlemen," Meade replied, "for it is too late to leave it." By the time he'd made a brief moonlight inspection of Culp's and Cemetery Hills, dawn was breaking, and Hancock's 3 divisions were filing into position on Cemetery Ridge, having completed their all-night march from Taneytown. Sykes had reached Hanover and turned west in the darkness. He would arrive within a couple of hours. Only Sedgwick's corps was not at hand, the largest of the 7. Uncle John had promised to make it from Manchester by 4 o'clock that afternoon, and though it seemed almost too much to hope that so large a body of men could cover better than 30 miles of road in less than 20 hours, Meade not only took him at his word, he announced that he would attack on the right as soon as Sedgwick got there. Lee's headquarters tents were pitched in a field beside the Chambersburg Pike on the western slope of Seminary Ridge. When he rose from sleep an hour before dawn, about the same time Meade drew rein beside the gate on Cemetery Hill, his intention, like his opponent's, was to attack on the right. He had arrived at this decision the previous evening in the course of a twilight conference north of Gettysburg with Ewell, whom he found gripped by a strange paralysis of will, apparently brought on, or at any rate intensified, by Lee's stipulation that an assault on the Bluecoats attempting a rally on the hilltop south of town, though much desired, not only could not be supported by troops outside his corps, as Ewell had requested, but also was to be attempted only if he found it practicable, which Ewell interpreted as meaning that he must be certain of success. It occurred to him that in war few things were certain, least of all success, with the result that he refrained from taking any risk whatever. First he waited for Johnson, whose division did not come onto the field until past sundown, and finally called the whole thing off, finding by then that the heights beyond the town bristled with guns and determined-looking infantry, deployed in overlapping lines, well dug in along much of the front, and heavily reinforced. Though it was not Lee's way to challenge an assessment made by a general on ground which he himself had not examined, when he arrived for the conference, he indicated his regret by expressing the hope that Ewell's decision would not apply to next day's operation. "Can't you, with your corps, attack on this front tomorrow?" he asked. Ewell said nothing, nor did Rhodes, whose accustomed fieriness had been subdued by his narrow escape from disaster in his first action as a major general, and Johnson was not present. That left Early, who did not hesitate to answer for his chief that an offensive here on the left, after the Federals had spent the night preparing for such a move, would be unwise. However, he added, indicating the round tops looming dimly in the distance in the dusk, an attack on the right, with a mass of Bluecoats concentrated northward to meet the expected threat from Ewell, offered the Confederates a splendid opportunity to seize the high ground to the south and assail the Union flank and rear from there. Ewell and Rhodes nodded agreement, but when Lee replied, "Then perhaps I'd better draw you around toward our right, as the line will be very long and thin if you remain here, and the enemy may come down and break through." Early again was quick to disagree. In his view, that would spoil the whole arrangement by allowing the foe to turn and give his full attention to the blow aimed at his rear. As for the integrity of the present line, Lee need have no qualms. Whatever its shortcomings as a base from which to launch an offensive, the position was an excellent one for defense. Besides, Early went on to say, much captured material and many of the wounded could not be moved on such brief notice, not to mention the effect on morale if the troops were required to give up ground they'd won so brilliantly today. Lee heard him out, then pondered, head bent forward. The main thing he disliked about the proposal was that it required a change in his preferred style of fighting, typified by Manassas, where he had used the nimble Second Corps to set his opponent up for the delivery of a knockout punch by the First Corps, whose specialty was power. Early was suggesting what amounted to a change of stance, which was neither an easy nor a wise thing for a boxer to attempt even in training, let alone after a match was underway, as it was now. Head still bowed in thought, Lee mused aloud. Well, if I attack from the right, Longstreet will have to make the attack. He raised his head. Longstreet is a very good fighter when he gets in position and gets everything ready, but he is so slow. The extent of his perplexity was shown by this criticism of one subordinate in the presence of another, a thing he would never have done if he had not been upset at finding the commander of the Second Corps, famed for his slashing tactics under Jackson, content to fall back on the defensive with a victory half won. However, when Early, still speaking for his chief, who seemed to have lost his vocal powers along with those employed to arrive at a decision, assured him that the 3 divisions would be prompt to join the action as soon as the attack was launched across the way. Lee tentatively accepted the plan and rode back through the darkness to Seminary Ridge. Once he was beyond the range of Early's persuasive tongue, however, his doubts returned. He reasoned that the blow, wherever it was to be delivered, and he had not yet decided on that point, should be struck with all the strength he could muster. If Ewell would not attempt it on the left, he would bring him around to the right, thus shortening the line while adding power to the punch. Accordingly, he sent him instructions to shift his 3 divisions west and south at once if he was still of the opinion that he could launch no drive from where they were. This not only restored Ewell's powers of speech, it brought him in person to Army headquarters. Dismounting with some difficulty because of his wooden leg, he reported that Johnson had examined the Federal position on Culp's Hill and believed he could take it by assault. This changed the outlook completely, for if Culp's Hill could be taken, so could the main enemy position on Cemetery Hill, which it outflanked. Happy to return to his accustomed style, which was to use his left to set his opponent up for the knockout punch he planned to throw with his right, Lee canceled Ewell's instruction for a shift and directed instead that he remain where he was, with orders to seize the high ground to his front as soon as possible. By now it was close to midnight. Ewell rode back to his own headquarters north of Gettysburg. Lee pondered the matter further. Since Longstreet, who would deliver the major blow, was not yet up, whereas Ewell was already in position, he decided to time the latter's movement by the former's and sent a courier after Ewell with instructions for him not to advance against Culp's Hill until he heard Longstreet open with his guns across the way. This done, Lee turned in at last to get some sleep, telling his staff as he did so, "Gentlemen, we will attack the enemy as early in the morning as practicable." Rising at 3 a.m., he ate breakfast in the dark and went forward at first light to the crest of the ridge, preceded by a staff engineer whom he sent southward in the direction of the Round Tops to reconnoiter the ground where the main effort would be made. To his relief, as he focused his glasses on the enemy position, though he saw by the pearly light of dawn that the Federals still held Cemetery Hill in strength, the lower end of the ridge to the south appeared to be as bare of troops as it had been at sunset. Longstreet soon arrived to report that McLaws and Hood were coming forward on the pike, having camped within easy reach of the field the night before, all but one of Hood's brigades, which was on the way from New Guilford, more than 20 miles to the west. Pickett, too, was on the march, having been relieved by Imboden the day before at Chambersburg, but could scarcely arrive before evening. Glad at any rate to learn that Hood and McLaws were nearby, Lee then was startled to hear old Peter return to yesterday's proposal that the Confederates maneuver around the Union left and thus invite an attack instead of attempting one themselves against so formidable a position as the enemy now held. While Longstreet spoke, the force of his words was increased by the emergence on Cemetery Ridge of brigade after brigade of blue-clad soldiers, extending the line southward in the direction of the Round Tops. However, Lee rejected his burly lieutenant's argument out of hand, much as he had done the previous afternoon, although by sunup it was apparent that his plan for a bloodless occupation of the enemy ridge would have to be revised. Longstreet lapsed into a troubled silence, and at that point A.P. Hill came up, still pale and weak from illness. Except to report that his whole corps was at hand, Anderson having arrived in the night, he had little to say. Heath was with him, his head wrapped in a bandage, too badly shaken by yesterday's injury to resume command of his division, which was to remain in reserve today under Pettigrew, the senior brigadier. Hood rode up soon afterwards ahead of his men. As he watched the bluecoats cluster thick on the ridge across the mile-wide valley, Lee told him what he told his corps commander earlier. The enemy is here, he said, and if we do not whip him, he will whip us. Hood interpreted this to mean that Lee intended to take the offensive as soon as possible, but Longstreet took him aside and explained in private, "The general is a little nervous this morning. He wishes me to attack. I do not wish to do so without Pickett. I never like to go into battle with one boot off."